Good evening and welcome to Worldview, the international affairs show that brings you the news and views that other networks can't or won't tell you about. I'm Alan Mendoza. Our show tonight, Europe and America, or Eurabia's appeasers and the aggressors of the new imperium. Justified perceptions or unwarranted hysteria. Once upon a time, Europeans and Americans were engaged in a love affair. In those halcyon days, Europe would admire the boldness, brashness and energy of America, while America would gaze in awe at the culture and refinement of Europeans. But those days are long gone. Open up a newspaper, pick up a book or surf the internet today, and you're more likely to be confronted with an entirely different set of images. Europe is increasingly seen in America as weak, morally decadent and in demographic decline. Some commentators have gone as far as to say that its failure to stand up for its cultural values and difficulty in integrating Muslim communities will eventually lead to its collapse into an entity labelled Eurabia. On the flip side, America is now seen in Europe as an ignorant and boorish bully, possessed by a religious fervour to throw its weight around internationally. Some have gone as far as to say that the USA is now the biggest threat to global peace. So how much truth are there to these stereotypes, and how have the respective European and American intelligentsias come to form them? And does it matter in the context of international relations that we seemingly hold each other in such contempt? And what are the implications of such attitudes for the future conduct of international policy? Well, joining me tonight in the Worldview studio to unpick this topic are the Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, Douglas Murray, the editor of the Liberal magazine, Benjamin Ramm, and the Henry Jackson Society's cultural guru, Mark Sidwell. Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining me on this sort of more culturally focused worldview tonight. It's a big problem, obviously, this issue of the cultural stereotyping. Ben, let's start with you. How real are these perceptions at the moment? Is it true that Europeans and Americans do things this way, or is it just me exercising journalistic license to say that?
Certainly there's a grain of truth to the stereotypes, but I think it's important to delineate between the cultures in a different manner than simply dividing them by continents.
Fine.
So it's crucial for us to say that the challenge we all face is between liberals and illiberals at home and abroad. And those illiberals may be seen in authoritarian big government in the Middle East. They may be seen in Bush's reactionary policies towards civil liberties in the United States. And it is crucial for liberals around the world to stand in solidarity with individuals on all three continents and to say that what divides us here is not geographical space, but the fight for tyranny and the challenge to a sort of cultural relativism, of which I'm sure Mark will address, that has infected large swathes of the Western intelligentsia.
Mark, do you buy that?
I'd certainly buy the cultural relativism part. I'm less happy, I think, with equating George Bush and Muslim Tehran or something like that, which there was a touch of there. I mean, I grant you there are issues about illiberal conservatives, particularly in some areas of America, but that's not to say that they can be put on the same plane as people.
I'm not suggesting
no,
they are.
There was a touch of that there, and I just think it's important to be clear about that at least. I just wanted to clarify that.
What's driving it for you then, Mark, in the sort of stereotyping? What's behind it all?
Well, I think actually it's been around longer than we like to think. I mean, I know the war has brought it out and made it very obvious, but for instance, recently I saw a rerun of the first edition of Spitting Image, and they did a sketch about Reagan. And you could put a Bush puppet through the same sketch, and it would have been identical. It was all about the president's brain is missing, and he's such a fool, and you can shoot him, and you won't even notice, and things like that. So I don't think it's changed that much. And if you look, for example, at Philippe Roger's book last year or the year before about French anti-Americanism, he was showing the history of that going back over centuries, and so I think these things go deeper than we think. It's not just a recent phenomenon.
A fair point. Then, Douglas, is it more virulent nowadays then than 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago?
What?
Anti-Americanism in Europe, anti-Europeanism in America?
Well, I mean, it's been talked up a lot, yeah. And there are people with an interest in talking it up. It should be stated. Once, for instance, you've written a book saying Europe is in decline, you kind of have a vested interest in it declining, otherwise you'll prove to be an idiot at parties. And vice versa, if you keep on saying that America is the authoritarian Nazi state without parallel in human history, then you kind of have an interest in hoping that American civil liberties are further taken away, in the hope that you'll be proved right in your fatuous thesis. But what I think is happening at the moment is we do have a few people on each side who have kind of blown the ground open a bit. I mean, back to yours, Eurabia is one example. Mark Stein's latest book, America Alone. And then all, of course, of the putrid effusions of Noam Chomsky and co. on the other side. So, you know, the ground's very open, and there's a lot of room in the middle now. And most people are there, but sadly, as always, the louder you shout, the more you get listened to, and the wackier your thesis, the more press you're going to get.
Well, yes, that's a very fair point.
I mean, just sort of following up on Doug's point with which I concur about, if you like, the Chomskyite left, which finds its articulation as easily on the European continent, certainly in France, and with the sort of John Pilger sympathisers in Britain, that one has to remember that many of the valueless judgments that are coming from supposedly, in inverted commas, progressives may be found stateside. And indeed, partially because of the power of the American intelligentsia, and also because of the greater sense that the American intelligentsia has influence in the public sphere. One always senses that British academe, particularly after the Thatcher years, resorted into an almost monastic state, whereas in America you still have, one still gets the sense that think tanks are hugely influential, that the cultural sense reflected by Chomskyism unites the European and American left quite easily.
Yes, I mean, you can look at it. I suppose, thinking about what you're saying, actually, I'm just trying to look at a distinction between sort of personality and politics-driven, though, sort of stereotyping. And Mark, we were having a discussion before, and you raised the point that, say, if a different president was elected, and you made the point just about Reagan, but people weren't saying the same thing about Clinton in that sense. Is it personality-driven? Is it really Bush has provoked the ire? And Ben, of course, mentioned Bush's illiberalism earlier. Is it that has caused this stereotyping to explode again and to have these theses to be promoted? Or is it more a case of politics driving it?
Well, I think it might be the political parties do differ in this. I mean, very interestingly, just yesterday, Mitt Romney was making a speech in which he said and accused Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and...
I like that, Hilton.
Hilton,
that's a good call.
We'll leave that one. And some of the other candidates of pushing America, wanting to pull America towards Europe. He was saying that as an insult.
It would be an insult. I mean, it is an insult. It would be a dreadful thing if America was pulled in any way towards Europe, in which, incidentally, I don't particularly include Britain. But it would be a dreadful thing. I mean, a lot of American commentators are right on this. I mean, as we know, I mean, Europe as a continent...
So there is some truth in this.
Yeah, I mean, Europe as a continent is typified currently by very second-rate politicians running it, on a strange consensus of the centre-left, which they don't seem to question at any point. They seem to regard the future as being an inevitable state in some sort of hinterland where one pays more and more taxes in order that they can distribute our money worse and worse. And there's no questioning of that. That's just what's going to happen. And we'll be safer and cuddlier and more secure and happier if this happens. It's a societal project. I mean, it can't be stressed enough that the other things that used to fill up these gaps, the church and so on, have in Europe seen a decline which isn't irreversible, but is undoubtedly there, and where the elites of Europe decide not to refer to our heritage and our past in their constitution. I mean, this is an important one, for instance, on the European constitution. Yeah. You can write the American constitution, you can carry the American constitution, I know a lot of people do, round in your pocket. If you tried to carry the EU constitution around for any time, you'd break your back. This is a document of incredible fatuity, and it can't be stressed enough that America still is built on ideas and on dreams and on prospects, which you can see still, and I know it's a cliche, but you can see it in your recently arrived American immigrant who believes that tomorrow is going to be a better day than today, and that if they have one taxi car today, next month they might have two, and by 10 years from now they might have a chain. And you compare that with general perceptions, and all polling seems to bear this out in Europe. If you just ask polls in Europe, if you ask people in a poll in Europe whether they believe, for instance, that tomorrow is going to be a better day, or whether they're going to be better off next year than today, of course they don't. Why should they? They're going to be taxed more next year. They're going to have their societies falling apart a bit more next year. They're going to have less and less social cohesion next year.
I just wonder whether we can sort of slightly move away from an advert for conservative tax policy and maybe make a differentiation between the America as metaphor and even as adjective, and a pragmatic global understanding of America. So we speak of immigrants who have gone there. Obviously, Christopher Hitchens is an individual who has
by no means typical.
Who has he has
You never want to be called that.
He has reinvigorated this debate, but one has to understand that for Christopher...
Hang on, what debate?
For the situation of the relation between Europe and America. And for example, one has to understand that for Christopher, his understanding and engagement with the idea of America is couched in an Enlightenment, almost romantic sense. America is adjective, the possibilities of a new global state. And of, which tie into a sort of liberal interventionist ideal. Now, I think it's problematic to say, as I understand that you were discussing with Alan earlier, that this is characteristically a problem under George W. Bush. If we look at the reception of America, for example, in Latin America during the 80s and early 90s, America is still being seen as a pariah state, as a nation that is not faithful to its constitution, to its values, which your friends carry around in their pockets. And I wonder whether it's important to, rather than suggesting that continents are monolithic and that Europe now represents a sort of degraded moral
I'll tell you,
state.
Far, far from it. Continents are not monolithic anymore, and Europe is describing how not monolithic they are, because Europe 20 years from now is going to look very, very different from Europe today and very different from Europe 50 years ago. This is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that Americans used to know what they could rely on in Europe. They used to typify certain countries. They used to say, France will have these characteristics and that characteristics.
Well,
you can't
say that.
Yeah, well, they do. But you can't say, you won't be able to say what France is going to behave like in 20 years' time. You won't be able to say that it'll be the same suspicious way that in which it behaves at present. The continent of Europe is changing in such major ways because of demographics, because people aren't having enough children, because of the incredible, overwhelming immigration which has happened way beyond any scale which any of the societies in Europe can cope with that have had to put up with it. And so the truth is that what America used to believe was its ally continent, or countries which it understood, has now slipped away, and I don't think anyone's going to be able to get that back again.
Mark, is it that serious? Douglas painted a very...
No,
having started, I know, by saying...
I'm sort of startled into such... No, I mean, I think it's terribly important, and I do worry about this. It's particularly a problem with American conservatives, that they do start to think Europe's lost, and it's desperately important that they don't think that we keep pointing out to them that Europe and America actually need each other in the problems.
But is Europe lost?
face.
I mean, Douglas has made the point that in 20 years, in his view, Europe will be lost, or changed at the very... I mean, changed or lost. Would you use the term lost?
We might not have thought in the past that
would you use it lost, though? Yes.
No, it's not yet lost, but it could be. But we used to talk in the past about what the Élysée would behave like, what the French Foreign Ministry would do and things. I don't think we'd have ever guessed, say 50 years ago, that we would come to a point where the French president effectively doesn't have that much control over his, or indeed any control over his foreign policy in, say, the Middle East, because he has such a huge 10% of his population which is radicalized and willing to turn out on the streets if he supports a war or argues for something which they don't agree with. It's undoubtedly it's going to change your society, it's going to change your cabinet, it's going to change the way you run politics. And really, you can't pretend it won't, because, I mean, you see someone like Jack Straw has a very large Muslim community in his constituency, which is going to be growing. That's going to change the way people like him vote. If you're going to stand in Jack Straw's constituency at the next election, you better make sure that you're not a raving pro-Zionist neocon.
But to take the case of Jack Straw, of course, he stood up and made the case about face veils because he was so worried about it, because he was encountering it in his constituency. I think what will happen is that, I mean, I agree, it's important that people talk about this and they realise that in France, those cities where there are those issues in the banlieue, in Holland, where there's going to be the issue of Muslim majorities in some of their cities really very soon, these are important things that we talk about. But to suggest that it's all going to fall away...
Well, if it's not going to fall away, what are we going to do?
What I'm saying is, I think that there's a...
What are we
talk
going
about
to
it in terms
do?
of demographics, and it suggests that it's about majorities. It's not. It's a problem of a kind of fascism. And as it's a kind of fascism, it's about a minority who use brutality and violence to control the majority. So it's about putting down a small number of people who are very dangerous. And I think it's important to characterize it that way, instead of a flood of people overwhelming us.
The point is that your small minority plays to a larger and larger home pool.
I don't deny it's a problem, but I just think that it's important that we're going to have to deal with it.
But what are you going to do to deal with it?
about
We
talking
can't
about it
tell
openly.
America. We can't tell America that Europe's nearly lost, that it's quite a bit away from being lost, or that we're in a really bad state, unless we have some kind of answer. We can't play that game. Either we know what we're going to do to stop it, or we should tell them that we're moving over quite soon.
But Britain has been doing well, I think.
Give me the
in this.
green card.
Yes. Well,
Okay, I mean, you've been watching this.
Yeah,
right? I mean, I guess the first thing, there's a practical point. I mean, what does it actually mean to say that the continent that created and that cultivated liberalism as a political and an international philosophy, and that did so much to disseminate liberal ideas around the world, is lost? I mean, what exactly does that mean? It is at the moment a nexus for... and I know Douglas has spent some time in Holland, for the challenges facing the ideal liberal society. For, who will stand for plurality is the question that we face in Europe. And will the liberals who believe in a heterogeneous society, but one bound together by a commitment that every individual holds to be a good citizen under, if you don't like the EU constitution, a certain set of values? Or will it be one whereby the unholy alliance of socialists and hard conservatives, whether they be in the Islamic community or whether they be those who in the West defended hardline Islamic reactions to the cartoons as we witness, will they come together in an unholy alliance to challenge liberals? So the sense of saying Europe is lost doesn't seem to me to be particularly productive.
The question of our values is an important one, which we come back to. I mean, my point about the American Constitution is, if you can't put your values or pretty much on one piece of paper, if you need thousands of pages, I'm suspicious that you might not have any values, and this might be padding. I mean, it seems to me, and it's very much the case in Britain at the moment, that our values are such, the things that we know we believe in or believed in, the institutions of state, the rule of law, the monarchy, the church, all of these great things that made Britain, have one by one been attacked. The education system, further education, our collegiate systems, have one by one been attacked. And more than that, more importantly than that, people who say they support them feel slightly embarrassed as they do so. I mean, Orwell pointed this out 60 years ago, so part of it isn't new. But the notion that you can't stand up for any of your values, and that if I asked the average person on the continent of Europe, what do you believe in, the likelihood would be either that one would be, one is, brought back with a sense of either cynicism, that there are no particular values, or dumbfounded incomprehension. People are embarrassed by it. That's not something you find in America, and I'm not surprised that Americans are suspicious of Europeans when they can't even say what they stand for.
Okay, but many of Americans' values, of course, originate on the European continent. The American Constitution,
being secured there.
Right, absolutely. Ignoring the attempt to sort of use Orwell to defend, a sort of conservative church and an educational system, both of which he passionately opposes. I wonder whether it's possible, and we're going to touch on this a little later, to speak about the importance of American, European, and Middle Eastern liberals and Democrats uniting to form a global commitment to stand for securing liberties and human rights across the world, and for us to not posit, as you have suggested, that some irresponsible journalists do, that certain continents represent monolithically certain attitudes towards the world, but that we are all open, that we all fight the horror of authoritarianism and reactionary politics, and that we must all unite to challenge those things.
Yeah, but we come back to the point of what are you going to do to challenge them? And it's all very well for Europeans to talk about standing for their values, but in recent years in particular, they've proved very bad at standing for those values. Every time, for instance, freedom of speech issues have come up in this continent, if I include Britain in Europe for a moment, we failed badly. Every time, I mean, you know, you would not find a case analogous to that which has happened in most European countries now, where writers have been prosecuted. I'm thinking of Oriana Fallaci in Italy, I'm thinking of Michael Houellebecq in France, I'm thinking of Fallaci again in France. You wouldn't find these cases in America, and if you did, they'd be chucked out of court. Europeans are proving very bad at defending those values, and when it comes to religious belief, which they're not even willing to put into their constitution and acknowledge their own history on it, you can't help finding again and again in the people who are telling them to find themselves, you find non-believing atheist Jews and Christians and so on saying that Europe has to re-find its soul. You go, as if religion is once again just something like Voltaire says, for the servants, as if it's for other people, but of course I don't believe that rubbish. You know,
so Europe's movement away, its finding of its liberal and democratic heart, was not couched in an orthodox theological understanding of the nature of civil liberties. It actually came, you know, again using Voltaire in a strange manner, I think, that it actually came in the movement against the reactionary orthodoxies that were prevalent in Europe. And to say that the heritage of Europe is simply a Judeo-Christian monolith, one which is historically incorrect, and two which is unfaithful to the Enlightenment and Romantic individuals who fought against those successes, is to be unjust, and also to ignore the heritage of the American Constitution, which is a finding and a revealing of Voltaire across the sea.
I think that's preposterous. The idea that the American Constitution is a revealing of Voltaire is just laughable. The French understand there's a very deep difference between the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment, and also and between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. That's why they fight so much. And furthermore, the important thing about the American Constitution is it's a neoclassical project as much as an Enlightenment project. And that it's based in very deeply in Western
Let's bring in Ben's article now at this point, because it's relevant. So do you want to introduce it quickly? And
yeah, there's an excellent new book, almost a monograph, by Danny Postel, who's a senior editor at Open Democracy, entitled, not particularly catchingly, Reading Legitimation Crisis in Tehran, Iran and the Future of Liberalism. Now, it plays on reading Lolita in Tehran. Legitimation Crisis is a relatively opaque 1975 work by Jürgen Habermas. But what Postel explores in this book, which is genuinely exciting, is the way in which in Tehran dissidents and Democrats are reading Kant, Arendt, Habermas, Richard Rorty, the late Richard Rorty, who visited Tehran and was received extremely positively by Democrats who were reading him outside of academia, who were reading him in the public sphere, who were attempting to envisage what a public sphere away from theocratic reactionaries might look like. And what's fascinating is not only that these ideas, the ideas of Habermas, have real material currency, but also that reactionary clerics are reading Heidegger, and that some of them are reading Antonio Negri, the Marxist philosopher. And when Negri goes to Tehran, he's not received particularly well, because when he speaks about the mode of mass production, Iranians respond, but we're not particularly interested in the mode of mass production. We're concerned with key liberal ideas about the importance of a secular public sphere, about the importance of individuals finding their own means outside a sort of homogenous, autocratic, authoritarian government.
So, to distill your argument, essentially, this is a base of your liberal alliance, if
Absolutely.
you like. Yeah. Mark, prospects of this happening?
Well, certainly, I think the important thing to remember about Iran is how pro-American it is. Indeed, I mean, we may have all sorts of issues in Europe, but in terms
rolling his eye.
No, in the mass of Iranians, I think there is a great deal of pro-American sentiment. I agree that there's a horrible problem with a regime, but
no, I roll my eyes merely because it's what we've heard for decades. And actually, when are we going to see them?
I think we'll see them when the regime goes. I'm not
Which
saying...
will be when?
Well, it depends when George Bush...
I mean, my point is that the egg timer of the extremists being kicked out of office by this pro-American surge...
Oh, I'm not saying that.
Seems to me to be too far away.
Yes,
I've been promised
that
it for a long time.
Yes, I think it'll probably come to bombs falling on nuclear programs before then, but... in the long run.
One hopes...
Do you want to do my story next? My story's related to that.
I think it is. I think, bring in your story.
Because I was going to cite as my story of the week a very, very interesting and good piece by Daniel Pipes in yesterday's New York Sun, extending bringing to a greater public notice the work of two young American scholars about Israel's capability to strike Iran's nuclear reactors, which really, I think, changes the power play in the region over this one, because it's always been assumed, or it's been assumed for a couple of years now, since talk has been going on about taking out Iran's nascent nuclear project, that Israel, as it were, couldn't go it alone. And this article by Daniel Pipes yesterday, based on this research, shows that actually Israel can certainly go it alone. It has the capabilities. It has, of course, we know the planes, but it turns out that various of the missiles needed, there's been war games and it would work. And what's more, the suggestion is made that if they can fly along the borders of, say, Saudi and so on, neither country needs to object. So whether or not they'll do it, I think it's unlikely. But it's a very important story, I think, because one of the presumptions which Tehran will be making and many of the other powers in the region about Israel's inability to act alone has just been busted. And I think that the necessary pressure that needs to be put on Iran can really be heightened at this point. If Israel can go it alone, if it can do it without America, then I hope Iran sits up and takes notice.
Ben, do you share this optimism about this article and this study?
I defer to Mark, and I will come back to you.
Yes, I was going to bring in another story, which I wasn't going to talk about, but in relation to this, I think is very interesting. Of course, America and Israel have been wargaming just this weekend, I think.
Everyone, the point now, everyone should wargame all the time. It's what Defence Department's meant to do.
They work together.
Paris is wargaming.
No, but they've been doing a major co-military exercise, which has been also timed in with Israel launching a new military satellite. So I think they're certainly at least trying to frighten Tehran or make Tehran realise.
So this satellite does what exactly? Is it?
It passes over Syria and Iran sort of every 90 seconds, kinds of thing. It's the last one, tanked, so they've been a while without one.
Can I just say something on many Iranian Democrats? Ramin Jahanbegloo, who is one remarkable philosopher who Danny speaks with in this book, point out that liberals have to be very, very careful and not to play into Ahmadinejad's hands. Now, when the United States, when George W. Bush announced £75 million worth of support for Democrats, for funding Democrats, to challenge the conservative clerics, he did so in a manner that allowed Ahmadinejad, who uses a sort of populist anti-Americanism, to come out and say, look where the Democratic opposition stems from. So the first thing is, that money hasn't actually been received, as far as we're aware. And secondly, it was done wholly unhelpfully. And I wonder whether... I'm not sure exactly what the response to where are those Democrats now. It's obviously not an easy society in which to articulate one's views in terms of being pro-American. And I don't think that there's any purpose for Iranian Democrats saying they are pro-American. They believe in a secular public sphere. They fight passionately for the rights of women, to express their views, to have an education. All of these things that we find ourselves still fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan because we have not executed that war correctly.
I would just point out that in this case, if there are indeed these Democrats in Iran, we need to see them. We need to see them, they need to speak louder. And just finally, on the point of the funding, the $70 million from Washington, they announced it publicly. Yes, that's not a great idea, but on the other hand, you can rely absolutely on the fact that if they hadn't announced it, the New York Times would have bust the story a little bit later and broken it against all national security interests, and it would have been inevitable. It would have found the way on the front page that way. So maybe you just announce it before the New York Times does.
We're going to have to cut you off there.
That's fine. I'm not sure it warrants a response.
At that point. Well, look, that was their view as usual. This was Worldview. Join us again next week for yet another heated and highbrow discussion. Thank you.